in my classroom on a Saturday, and you're probably wondering why, because most teachers, like myself, don't believe in coming to work on the weekend. But let me tell you why. If you're a Tennessee teacher, you know why I'm here, because I'm sitting in front of my classroom library on a Saturday because the Tennessee General Assembly passed a law that basically says, get this, if a teacher wants his or her students to read any of the books at school or in the teacher's classroom, the teacher has to catalog every single book.
I don't think people understand how bad things are right now, and I think that this TikTok provides a pretty clear example of the direction that things are going.
Once they catalog them, they send them to their class or their school library. Librarian. The librarian has a list of books that are approved or not approved based on I don't even know what, honestly. And then from that list, the ones that are approved, she's like, okay, these are approved. So I have to go through all these books and then pull out the ones that are not approved. And then from the list that wasn't approved that she didn't have, she sends that to someone higher up. So they get the list, and then they go through the list of books that she didn't have, and then they determine whether these books are appropriate, not appropriate, whether they're approved or not, and then they send that back. And then, so I have to go through all the books again, take out the ones that are not approved, either by the librarian or whomever, and then after I do all that, then I have to post that list online for all my parents to see in case they want to chime in about the books that are in my classroom. And then after that, the kids can start reading the books in my library, in my classroom library.
So this TikTok by a teacher named Sydney Rawls points out the fact that Tennessee has recently passed this law that requires not only school libraries but also teachers to catalog all of their books to make sure that every single one of these books correctly qualify and meet the standards for what Tennessee thinks is age appropriate for children. Now here's the thing though, when they say age appropriate, they don't actually mean that. What they mean is that it ideologically aligns with the most restrictive white supremacist worldview out there. That fundamentally, children's books are not allowed to explore topics like, for example, some of the characters just being gay. But instead of just having a list of a few books that are banned based off of these bigoted criteria, Tennessee has gone all the way to create this over-the-top bureaucracy to make sure that at every step of the way, if you want to have a book in a classroom, that the school board's going to have to look at it, the school is going to have to look at it, and the parents have to all be able to look at it. Which you could say, oh, well, that sounds like it's all about transparency. But it's not. The reason why they're creating this over-the-top, arcane, bureaucratic system is to basically open up every classroom to the nosiest busybodies who are the most bigoted and least tolerant in the community so that they can demand that their worldview is enforced through the law. And that speaks to something further, because this is one of the tools that fascists use to maintain social control. What they do is they encourage people to be nosy busybodies. They encourage the most bigoted people around to involve themselves in the affairs of as many people as they possibly can, and to create state apparatuses that are designed in such a way to let these nosy busybodies use the power of this state to enforce their views onto other people. Because the thing is, it's actually really hard to track everybody everywhere. So if you have a bunch of bigoted weirdos that basically make their whole existence just bothering other people and getting involved in other people's business, then you can rely on them being the hall monitors in society that weaponize the institutions of the state against people that they disagree with. And fundamentally, what is happening in Tennessee is a perfect example of that. And it's also a perfect example of how fascism creeps in. It isn't one day you wake up and all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness gracious, the fascists have taken over and everything is terrible all of a sudden. No, it's a slow creep. It's things like this. They gradually normalize more and more policing of your behavior. They gradually normalize more over-the-top violent rhetoric against marginalized people. And in this gradual normalization, they squeeze people more and more. It's not something that magically all of a sudden happens overnight. And so when we see things like this in Tennessee, we should all be raising alarm. Because this is, like we have seen in other states, a larger part of an effort to fundamentally indoctrinate children. And the worst part is that their goal is actually fairly easy. We live in a pretty racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic society, so there's a lot of baseline hatred and bigotry that go around. But the easiest thing to combat that bigotry is information. It's exposure and understanding. It's learning that there are other people in the world. But that is exactly what these schools are trying to prevent. They're doing everything within their power to make sure that children are not allowed to be told that it's okay to be gay, that it's okay to be trans, that this is just a normal part of the human experience. And in preventing that, they're hoping that the cultural hegemony that exists of bigotry will seep into the minds of these children so that by the time they're old enough that these censors aren't really applicable to them, that they will have already embedded within their mind a bunch of misogynistic, bigoted, hateful nonsense. Fundamentally, we're in incredibly dangerous territory. And with teacher shortages across the country, Republicans are using that as an excuse to bring in fundamentally unqualified people into education. Just look at Florida, for example. That is not a coincidence. That is not an accident. That is part of the plan. The goal is that ideologically minded people will become teachers, not necessarily qualified people. This is all with the hope that kids will grow up in an environment that is highly reactionary and will instill in them incredibly reactionary beliefs. This is something that the fascists in Nazi Germany did very explicitly. And it's something that the Republicans in the United States are also doing very explicitly. They are not hiding it at all. They are saying pretty clearly that they want kids to be indoctrinated. I know that they're saying we don't want kids to be indoctrinated, but that is like the most thinly veiled lie that you could possibly push, because their view of children being indoctrinated is it's just gay people existing in the books that like kids read and stuff like that. If their view of indoctrination is just recognizing the existence of people who are different, then I think it's pretty obvious that they actually support indoctrination. They're the ones that want people to be intentionally ignorant about the world and about the different people that live in the world. It's like the most thinly veiled lie, and there are too many people that are willing to accept their nonsense at face value. Fundamentally, at its core, right now, the Republican Party is a fascist party, and they are implementing policies that are very explicitly fascist policies. We are in incredibly dangerous territory, and if we don't do everything within our power to push back against this, the reality is that things are only gonna get worse. I wish I had some sort of magic solution that could solve this problem, but the reality is voting isn't enough to stop this. It needs organized strikes and protests and real movements to demand change. Because so long as giant companies think they can make a profit and continue to donate to these extreme right-wing Republicans, and as long as people silently accept these attacks on trans people and queer people more broadly, then things are only going to get worse. The First They Came For poem exists for a reason, and it is a pattern that we are unfortunately following right now. If you are not finding yourself in solidarity with homeless people, with trans people, with queer people more broadly, with people of color, with indigenous people, if you are not in solidarity with the most marginalized communities right now, if you think that it's unimportant because it doesn't affect you right now, then you need to realize that if this train is moving along, eventually it's going to reach your station.